We often approach society in a manner to save energy, but the very activities of trying to save energy are why we lose time energy, actually. So, for the attention economy to not just be in service of the logic of capital, it has to be a training ground for people to live according to high order causalities, logics outside of capital, which means it's changing how you think. So you ask yourself the following question. Am I reading books so that I can win trivia games or add to the certification? Or am I reading in such a manner that changes how I think? And the key characteristic you want your thinking to change is that you begin to value difficulty. So the question is the following, and I pass it on. How does one read to have something lit within you that then makes you willing to do something even if it requires suffering for you for its own sake, because of the way that it changes how you experience the world? A few tips. One, when you read a book, assume
we cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground. Oh my God. We were muted there. Hold on. Oh my God. Muted all the time, muted. I think it's because of Twitch, man. I've been really good on my mute game, but as soon as you get back on Twitch, something goes wrong where you just start to boomer out, because you want to give them an opportunity to sit there and say, you're a fucking boomer, you fucking retard, piece of shit, blah, blah, all the things that they like to say about us, which is true. It's all true. It's absolutely correct. But anyway, all right. So as I was saying, welcome, OG Rose, Daniel Garner in the house. How's it going, man?
I'm well, David. It's good to see you and Nance. And I started your series on Marx last night, and I have to applaud you both for that deep, close reading of an incredibly deep text. I'm not actually familiar with anyone doing that, so well done to you. And that's the kind of work that is needed, like you've said before, on working class theory being so tied to liberation, freedom, or thinking new possibilities. Well, that's what it takes. So well done to you both to be taking on that work.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to... we do so many of these like exegetical reading sessions, long form, anywhere between 4 and 8 hours. But we've not been doing the note taking as seriously as we need to, and a lot of it is just like, it's really exciting stuff. It's easier to react to, or I already know how to elaborate on it. And capital is for me like a vexed question, because I've seen the way that as a signifier it quilts discourses. People use it as the boogeyman. People use it as this force. It's like this kind of weird thing, and ultimately, to really ground ourselves out in the material, historical, but mostly critique levels of analysis when it comes to this world historical thing we call capital that is so good and so bad. You really do have to go back to not just all of these books, but also you've got to go to the expansion packs and insider and outsider critiques. And so also we're one of the biggest questions that has developed for us is value form Marxism versus labor theory of value Marxism. Value form Marxism is sort of springboard into so many of the things that Nance cares about, that I care about, that Mikey cares about, to the point where even if Marx turns out to be a labor theory of value, if he turns out to be a labor theory of value guy, like he's really a petite Ricardo, like Lenin thinks, like Kautsky thinks, like Engels thought, like everyone, well then we are going to have to challenge Marx using this interpretation from the value form Marxists. And that's ultimately part of a post-left or a post-Marxist or a post-whatever, post-politics standpoint that we're inhabiting right now. And that, we were just having a conversation with Ted Reese earlier, and he's in London, and he's a Marxist, and he already agreed to join us on a panel on Marxism versus post-Marxism, value form Marxism versus labor theory of value Marxism, all of this stuff. And so it's like, we're very intimidated. He's a very smart guy. All of these people are just like way ahead of us in a lot of ways. We're just these, as Nance says in his piece here in Underground Theory, I ain't no big city Marxist or anything. Like he says so. How did you say? Yeah, that's how you said that, right?
Yeah, oh, I'm not a big city lawyer like that, but I'm no big city Marxist. I'm just a country proletarian dickhead or whatever.
Yeah. It really felt like that getting with Chris Catrone and Daniel Tutt, like Daniel Tutt in Washington fucking DC, where the air shimmers with the charge of the symbolic. Like, it's like, whoa, oh, power resides here. And then
we drove right by the Pentagon.
Yeah.
We drove right by the Pentagon.
Yeah. They texted me. They were like, hey, we see you there. And then in Chicago with Catrone at like this super bougie art school, like where all these kids were snobs, like is amazing. Not all of them, but Anyway, let's take all that and segue it into what I wanted to talk to you about, and that is time energy structural stultification, or the structural stultification of time energy. You wrote an amazing review on my book, Time Energy, Why You Have No Time or Energy. In fact, you're the first person. So really, you get some kind of like a special award for being first to the game in a sort of sense. So good job. Absolutely. You did it. And I wanted to get into Ivan Illich and disablement because you think that there's a connection there. And so this all relates to the capital stuff, obviously, because capital and Marx and Heidegger working between and then going beyond Marx and Heidegger is, for me, where time energy theory comes out of. That plus my own personal life, working class. Nobody in my family went to college. Nobody ever had large energy infused repeatable blocks of time. We can't even imagine how our lives would be different if we did have that. And seeing that that's actually one of the major causal problems in our dysfunction. And it's not my parents' fault. It's not my pastor's fault. It's not my neighbor's fault. It's not my, realizing that at the end of the day, there are people with agency involved, but their horizon of possibilities has been collapsed by structural stultification of time energy in its reduction to labor power, and our entire lives being orchestrated towards a job-centric society. And this becomes a critique of most versions of socialism as well, which would propose that their alternative is still a job-centric society. And so you've read the book, you've had a lot to think about it, but you've also been seriously engaged with Ivan Illich for a long time. You've taught courses on Illich. My closest fellow traveler, or one of them, is going to be teaching a course on Ivan Illich at Theory Underground this year, and you had said props to him for that. But I want to give you an opportunity to kind of just like give us your Illich and kind of using time energy structural stultification as a springboard into talking about this idea of disablement.
Well, outstanding, gentlemen, and thank you for the opportunity. And I think the idea that the conditions of society do not allow the full realization of the human subject outside the logic of capital is extremely important, because if you do not realize that, then when you're given free time, the very thoughts that you think are going to be so conditioned by capital that you are not actually going to engage in realization that would have you work outside the logic of capital. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong about anything I say regarding your book, but I understand time energy to be an alternative logic to the logic of capital. Like, it's not merely free time. Like, obviously, free time with energy to do something with it is part of it, but there's also an entire horizon or hermeneutic of experience that comes with it. The reason why I also think this, kind of as a little note, speaks to why we have to go back to the original text, like of Marx or Hegel or et cetera, so forth, is because we don't actually realize that our very interpretation of these books is through the logic they're saying we're trapped in, which makes it very difficult to understand them. So then it's like so for example, I've been doing a lot on Tocqueville, and Tocqueville talks a lot about basically democracy is doomed because people can't handle anxiety, which is unmediated experience of the other. And what we tend to do is run to titles to hide from the other. Oh, I'm a business, and that's where he's like, the logic of commerce is going to take over. Well, the problem is, to really understand what Tocqueville is getting at as a very deep sociological reality, it's very hard to imagine the kind of anxiety that he is describing that people run from, because you're already situated in a socioeconomic order with capital. So it's like, what is Tocqueville talking about here? Well, likewise, it's very difficult to think of an alternative horizon of being to sort of suggest that Marx is suggesting we've lost, because you have lost it. Now you're reading Marx, you're like, what is this guy getting at? So there's always a funny problem that when you read a book telling you about a certain paradigm that you're in and trying to bring it to your attention, you're in that paradigm, which it makes it difficult to understand what they're saying. And if you go too quick to the secondary literature, actually, it's very likely often the secondary literature is interpreting through the paradigm that they're warning about. So it actually contributes to problems. And so you have, and this, I think, getting to Ivan Illich is very important. When you read Ivan Illich, he sounds kind of crazy. He's talking about like learning webs and the medical nemesis and this idea of shadow work. Is like, what is the guy talking about? The problem is that Ivan Illich is describing an entire different horizon of operation, something that would be more akin to time energy, that if you don't have time energy, it's hard to understand what the guy is saying. So you say, oh, he's just being a critic of like capitalism or something. Oh, he's just being difficult, blah, 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 blah. Well, this is where I think it gets into stultification, as you're describing. One of the reasons why we have to go through these books, and actually, in a sense, time energy has a hermeneutical reality, just like capital, because if you realize that when you read books, you always read them from the position of the logic of the society you are in, then you also actually need time energy in order to understand these texts in terms of time energy, right? So it's kind of interesting, and this kind of speaks to, like, I know you've spoken on Heidegger, where it's so important to realize that when Heidegger talks about Dasein, it's to get to deeper sociological reality. Some people talk about the clearing. It's not just to end on the existential, but the existential is to say, what is the horizon of the being in the world today that let's poke on and see if this actually suggests there's some deeper problem in operation, and you're trying to get to that. So likewise, what we have to do is understand that if we see that the average individual is lacking time energy or is bound by a certain logic of capital, then the question is, what are the conditions of society that make people have this logic? And here's the trick. In order for the logic of capital to have this kind of effect, you have to not realize your logic is situated by capital, right? Like, it's the idea of ignorance. You're only ignorant of something if you don't know you're ignorant. If you know you're ignorant, you're actually on the way out of it. So paradigms have to operate by making you not realize they're in the paradigm, because if you did, then that would be kind of step one to escaping. It's like the Kierkegaard notion that the man in despair must not know that they're in despair, because if you know you're in your despair, you're on the way out. So whenever you're talking about these entire logics that operate a society, there is the logic itself has a concealing mechanism. It has a way of not making it an option of logic, but the logic. It's like capital is not a logic of capital. It becomes the logic by which you operate, right? And so what happens is when you come into someone, the first thing I would say to start, in a lot of these concepts of a lot of these great thinkers, when you go in, you have to be skeptical of your inherent knee-jerk against them, or your sense of, they're all over the place, because actually that itself is part of the conditioning of capital to keep you from seeing the operations of capital, to use the Marxist language. So, and I think Ivan Illich in particular has actually been hurt by this. Also, the other is precisely because there's a kind of notion that it's hard to really understand what he's talking about because you're operating within a paradigm that he's critiquing as a whole. And then the other reason why is because I like to call Ivan Illich a core thinker versus more of a systematic thinker, which means just like in Nietzsche, I think there's a hot core of a critique of what I call bestocentrism, which is a notion of getting your values from something bestowed externally upon you. He critiques not just religion, but science, pragmatism, nationalism, all these things that bestow value, and it's in favor of choosing your own values. But it's a core that kind of pops up like lava all over the place in Nietzsche. Likewise, in Ivan Illich, when he's talking about the medical nemesis, when he's talking about the rights to useful unemployment, he has wonderful essays on the problems of disablement and how it disables us from thinking the possibility of different horizons or leisures in terms of development in foreign nations. He says we now define development in terms of becoming more disabled. Literally, what he says is like your development and your prosperity is in terms of how much you're operating according to capital without knowing it. Wow, what a kind of irony. That's an operation, right? But all throughout Ivan Illich, the core that's popping up, and then I'll pass it back to you, is basically, I call it a apocalypse of a revelation of the role of non-rationality in thinking. And what that means is the need for the ability to think outside the logic of the system that you find yourself presented in, which in this case would be capital. Because if you can only think according to that, then the rational thing to do would have you more following the system or losing time energy, all in the name of productivity. So that's a theme. So what happens if we only have one way of thinking when we go into schooling? What happens if we only have one way of thinking when we go into medicine or using our time or thinking about making the most of ourselves? If we only have one way of defining what a rational use of our potential is, that one way of using our potential is probably in service of the logic of the society. And he's thinking about, and basically then disablement is the inability to even think of the possibility of alternative logics. Like, and then if you're not able to think them, you also can't think that you're unable to think them. So it becomes a complete concealment. And that's occurring throughout all of Ivan Illich.
That's amazing. Yeah, that goes really good with the structural stultification of time energy and this problem that so many people are facing, which is that they really want to read this very short book about why they don't have time or energy, but they know they don't have time or energy, and so then they don't do it. And part of the issue is that energy doesn't just happen in a void. Energy is libidinal. Energy comes from the friction between desire and drive. Energy is, in a sort of sense, tied to or in relation to desire being desire of the other. And so when people tell me that they don't have time energy, it's just like, well, yeah, the transference hasn't happened enough yet, because otherwise you would have fucking read it. You actually would have. Because when a person actually has like this idea, oh, there's something in this book that I don't already know, and it gets at this problem about time and energy, they read it in a sitting. They always read it in a single sitting. Nobody who's told me they love this book didn't read it in a single sitting. They all read it in a single sitting. And then of course you get all these people who are like, oh my God, I can't even get to it. And it's just like, yeah, well, you've got like this endless list of books, and there's, you know, it's too much, and of course you'll never get to it. But the logic of capital and its accumulation is something that I kind of want to get into in a minute. But just to say that, like, we read books in a way that is in the logic of capital, right? And which would mean that going to Bordeaux, it's about the accumulation of social and cultural capital, right? So a person who says, oh, I want to read your book is ultimately saying something. It's a social capital accumulation. Oh yeah, you know, I'm trying to maintain some networking connections. I'm just letting you know, oh yeah, in theory I like, but okay, yeah, but what is it actually doing as a text? Well, the thing is if you read in this mode of cultural and social accumulation, it's all about like being able to have a hot take to say about every book. Maybe you've never even picked it up before, and you say, oh, well, that's actually just labor time. Or you say, oh, okay, yeah, that's just otium. Or you say, oh yeah, that's just, which is like the, you know, talk about totalization, right? The word just is one of the most violent words, if we're going to use violent in that totally unacceptable way that Levinas uses it, which is to say it downplays, dismisses, reduces, and totalizes. So I guess I want to turn it back over in terms of reading itself and how the logic of capital interferes with our reading. I want to hear this from Nance as well, but I want to give you the floor here for a second to kind of just go off on the logic, how you're thinking about how the logic of capital, its circuit, actually gets in the way of our ability to read, to interpret, to understand, and ultimately this structural stultification of time energy and disablement results in what I've been calling functional illiteracy, which, I mean, it's people use this term, but I mean, I use it in a very specific way. But I think this is exactly what you're getting at, which is that people aren't able to seriously sink their teeth into texts, right?
Excellent. To put it very quickly, the problem is we read books to be good at trivia games. So when we're asked random questions, we know the answers. Neil Postman had one of the most useful analysis of education as a medium. And I think we spoke about this before. And basically, the schoolroom in its very medium teaches you that a smart person is good at trivia. Because who knows the answer quickest than the teacher? And his whole point is that we're way too concerned, just like a Marshall McLuhan thing, we're way too concerned about the content of the schoolroom, not the medium of the schoolroom, which basically teaches you that in education, an educated person is good at fragmentation, basically. Like, do you know random stuff? It doesn't matter if you can connect all the answers together, just can you answer the quickest? Well, then the problem is you go into reading books not to wrestle with a great opponent, not to have your life called out, but to be good at trivia. And being good at trivia is then, well, the logic of capital. You showed up when you were told. It's all very authoritarian, basically, because what was the random question that was asked? You jumped through the hoop, you answered it. When are you supposed to be at work? You did it, and so on and so forth. Also, too, one of the reasons why the logic of capital in reading books like this works is because, in a way, it requires less of you. Now, in the long run, it takes your time, energy, so it costs more of you. But in the immediate, if you're just able to say the cliff notes of Marx, for example, that's way easier than, say, going like you're doing in the video, what line by line, what the heck is this guy talking about? So there's a kind of irony that, I'm obsessed with irony because I think a lot of this is irony. And irony is where X does Y to get Z, and Y is why X doesn't get Z. So likewise, we often approach society in a manner to save energy, but the very activities of trying to save energy are why we lose time energy, actually. Because, and so there's an irony at play. And that irony also feeds into the logic of capital because you should save energy for work. But then, of course, that means you're never using energy to kind of sublate it into some sort of different mode of being, right? So there's always an irony that's at play. So we read books in terms of efficiency. We go in to be like, how can I read this and save the most energy? Which then means you basically have to paraphrase it, right? But the great books, of course, so for me personally, the way I read books from a mode of, I don't know what I don't know. And not to win trivia, but from a place of, there's been so many times in my life when I look back and be like, I've read all the books, I've read enough books. I've had enough thoughts. I'm good to go. And then 10 years later, you're like, I wasn't even 3% in. Wow, I was an arrogant prick, right? And once you get that, once the penny drops, your relationship to books changes because you're aware that you're always prone to irony. You're always prone to having your logic be captured by an alternative logic. And you're always aware that actually, if you don't know something, you also don't know something. So that means you're vulnerable. And reading books can be a perpetual practice of keeping your eye on the ball. And keeping aware. And also, the very activity of reading a book and a sort of wrestling with it is precisely what starts to train the brain to not actually be susceptible to the logic of capital. Because one of the reasons why the logic of capital works so well, correct me if I'm wrong. Again, I have to admit, I got an hour into your talk, but if I recall from chapter 1 of Marx, there's really an emphasis on like flattening, compressing of logic into kind of price. Okay. So, well, the problem is the brain does that. Like the brain, when I look at a room, I don't see the whole room. I basically am always saying bookcase, I'm compressing, right? So basically capital comes along and says, hey, brain, you naturally do that. So let's create a socioeconomic paradigm that just aids you in that. Now, there's actually some use in that. Like there's some value, and I don't need to know the whole story of the product I'm buying. It's just the price. Okay. But here's the problem. That then trains you into a habit of compressing and never opening back up in your brain. And compression that stays compression is now flattening. Now it's impoverishment. And so what ends up happening is the entire way that the human operates in the world is naturally, because of the way the brain compresses to understand, susceptible to the loss of time energy, to being captured by the logic of capital, and actually ending up captured without realizing it. So you must regularly engage in practices that makes you resist the vulnerability to a compression that stays a flattening, and you have to view therefore books are basically an invaluable source of that training. So if you do not learn to read in this way, you are basically handing over your life to this kind of flattening. So that's one of the ways I think about it. And if you go into books realizing that, what is the Sloterdijk idea? You must change your life, this kind of you must kind of change it kind of notion. You must approach books as the call on you to change your life, or else you will fall into a logic of compression that becomes flattening. And if you do, you will not even know you did. And then, of course, you can't think that you did. And so these structural elements, I think, are quite important.
And what's flat? Cartoon characters.
What? Say that again, sir?
Cartoon characters. You become...
Yes.
You become, so it's like I use the term cartoon brained, right? But really, like, we all become shadows of ourselves. We all become cartoon characters. We all become flattened out, reductive. Like, you might be a full-grown adult, male or female, with a house and kids and taxes and blah, blah, blah. You've got a career. You've got the whole setup. But you're cartoonishly devoid of dimensionality, right? Sophistication, nuance, et cetera, et cetera. And so at a certain level, what can time energy theory do for society? What kind of politics does it lead to? I've got ideas about that, of course, and plenty to come. But at a certain level, it is about your own personal emancipation. If you are drowning and everybody's drowning, and someone is like, you're swimming for shore, you're trying to grab a life raft or whatever, and then somebody's like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? You realize everybody else is drowning too. It's like, bitch, I gotta get the fuck out of here. I gotta get to shore. As soon as I get to shore, yeah, we can talk about getting more life rafts. We can talk about ropes and helicopters and the National Guard. Fucking like, we'll see once I am not drowning. But that's the thing, is that structural stultification of time energy is drowning. It is ultimately to help you see that you are drowning, right, already. And so I think, like, I didn't realize that Illich wrote on disablement. But anyway, I'm sure this has provoked a lot of thought for both of you. And so, Nance, I'm just curious what you got so far. Yeah.
Yeah, it is like, it's like we're drowning, but we're drowning in a kiddie pool, and we don't realize we can, like, we're like this, and we can just do this and stop drowning. But we don't realize that, because the fish in the water, right? You referenced McLuhan, like, it's very much, you don't know what you don't know. And just having the ability to, it's not even about imagining new things. It's about imagining that there can be new things, imagining that there is a space for new things. And going back to Marx, I've realized that a lot of, maybe not realized, I think a lot of the Marxists that we think are getting it wrong, that are clinging to this labor theory of value thing, they are taking the idea of value on capital's terms, and that's what they're getting wrong. Like, that's what they're wrong about. They're wrong about the very thing itself. And that's not to say they're stupid and they're dumb. It's like, no, just put your feet down, man. Just rotate your orientation. And it's funny, the irony thing. Yesterday we went to the dog park, my partner and I, and on the way there, she's like, oh, I want to go to Dutch Brothers and get a coffee. And she didn't tell me that before we got in the car. And I was angry because I like things a certain way, right? And I get upset when I don't have my way. So I got angry and I was like, it's going to take 30 minutes. She's like, no, it's not. So we sat in the fucking drive-thru for 35 minutes to get this coffee. And the irony is that, like, oh, you go through the drive-thru because it's quick and easy and it saves time, right? But no, we actually wasted more time. We could have had our coffee and left in 7 minutes, but because we did the American thing of going through the drive-thru, we wasted over half an hour. We did the thing that kept us from getting the thing that we wanted to get. Yeah.
Well, I would know that's a wonderful example, because so much of the logic of capital leads you into irony that you can't identify as irony, but the way of things. Like, one of the key notions of Ivan Illich is that much of wage labor requires work outside of wage labor that he calls shadow work, that without wage labor is not possible, but you don't even think of it as labor because it's just what you do. Like, an example he makes is sitting in traffic. Like, in order for most wage labor to be possible, people have to do the work of sitting in traffic. Well, we don't even think of it as work. And he's like, yeah, that's exactly right. Because you're not paid for it. And the only thing that counts as quote unquote productive is what you're paid for. So you don't even have the eyes to see that you're working without getting compensated for it, right? And he also, like, the notion of data, and I'll give it to you, Nance, like the notion of creating data on Facebook, it's a similar sort of thing. That's an operation. Please, Nance.
I was just going to interject with data. Now it's even more so productive. Not only do we get to work so we can be productive, but while we're sitting in traffic, we're generating data for the data brokers. So the level of exploitation has just, like, exponentially increased on all of us. And we do see it as just the way things are, just the way it goes, rather than a situation, an artificial situation that we've been trapped in by the logic of capital.
Well, and also, too, I should just note, like, I know that with Cadell and Owen, y'all were talking about basically the impoverishment of the right, left, liberal, conservative types of things. It's very important to realize that so much of classical conservatism, if you look at your Tocquevilles, if you consider that, or Burke or whatever, is a defense of a common space, the commons, which was basically like there must always be something outside of the logic of market, because if not, actually both will be worse off. Market will be pathological, and like an example as I make is today, we find it basically impossible to have a home. All we can do is have an apartment. Because a home is a certain sort of dwelling space, is what Ivan Illich would say, right? But in order to have a house be a home or an apartment be a home, you have to have a ability to think outside the logic of what? Exchange, right? So, you know, one of the reasons why, like, there's a lot of classical conservative thought that actually is extremely critical of market logic and was trying to defend it. And, you know, you were speaking on Dugan. You know, Dugan, there's something about that. Now, this is why actually we need major thinking, because we have to think about the possibility of preserving spaces that defend us from logic market without using racism, xenophobia, and nationalism. That will definitely create you a space. That'll create you a barrier. And basically what it comes down to is ultimately, if we want to create, as to make a giant claim, if we want to create a space that is able to operate according to non-market logic, we as subjects have to create it for ourselves, as opposed to rely on sort of moral system or work to create it for us, because that's what we've mostly done in history, right? Like, to create non-market spaces, we've either created nationalism, we've created racism, we've created barriers. The reason why I've become very interested in the Nietzschean child, as Cadell has taught on in different things, is because the Nietzschean child does what? They choose their own values, which means they choose their own restrictions. Nietzsche talks about hanging a law over your neck, which means the child, from their own subjectivity, creates their own separate space, right? Now, this runs the danger of being atomistic and sort of separating from everyone, but that sort of space that you create as your own dwelling, that you operate according to your own values and your own logic within, is the only possibility of creating a space outside of wage labor now that is able to operate according to a logic that is not susceptible to the capture, and I'll talk about self-effacement and disablement we've talked about. But here's the trick. To be the kind of subject that can do that, you're going to need to read these books. You're going to need to engage in philosophy, handle anxiety. This is basically like Theory Underground, or, you know, these different spaces, is the necessary training to be the kind of subject that can choose your own values to create a space outside of market logic, which requires facing anxiety. And we've done everything in our power to avoid that. In the key notion of disablement, and then I'll pass it on, Ivan Illich has this wonderful idea, that line in his The Right to Useful Unemployment, where he says, if you decide to build your own house, like you get the skills and you build your own house with no help from experts, you're seen as a deviant, and you're seen as immoral, and you're seen as irrational. But actually, here's the key. The guy who can build his own house is what? He's capable. He's enabled. He's more fully human. But you're actually seen as kind of immoral for doing this sort of thing, or stupid, right? This is key. If you go online now and create a space outside of academia that actually is necessary for the creation of childhood so you can make a space of dwelling, you're seen as what? Wasting your time, irrational, so on and so forth. That's the logic of disablement that disables us from creating the spaces where we can have an area that's outside of capital logic, that if we don't have, then we have to only be susceptible to the logic of capital. But that means we have to face a certain anxiety and do something that I would call not irrational, but non-rational, meaning is it outside the logic of rationality defined as the society. So the whole Theory Underground, liminal web, people have different, is a space of non-rationality that can only be sustained by quote-unquote children, that if it does not exist, there is no space by which to train ourselves in the possibility of dwelling, that if we cannot do, then we must be basically captured by the logic of capital. But one of the reasons we like to be captured by the logic of capital, because all of this is very anxious producing, and we don't want to be seen by others as, irrational. But we have to face that. Thus, I think Mr. Ebert has a point when he says the meaning of life is courage. There's a lot of truth to that, I think.
Boom. Is this coming through okay? Is this microphone working?
Yes.
All right. You see I've changed things around a little bit here. I've got the Whiteboard. New Year's. What's up, everybody? This is like the new year where my experiments with the virtual classroom and the medium are, ready for a new phase. This is what I was trying to set up back in 2020, and then it didn't work out. So now we actually have a real whiteboard. I tried to use Zoom whiteboards, man. Doesn't work for me. It just doesn't work. And it's I actually need it. And so for the people who are joining, YouTube and Twitch, also people in the future who are watching this individual standalone segment. What's up, everybody? Yes, the liminal web or the underground theory scene, which ultimately Theory Underground and OG Rose and Philosophy Portal, we're all a part of trying to turn it, to bootstrap it into something more than just, short form, content that is like a sort of, well, what did you say? You said reading becomes trivia? Reading becomes...
Yeah, trivia becomes, yeah.
Yeah, and that's when Nance comes back, we'll give him an opportunity to talk about reading, because he said recently that until last year he had never read before. Obviously, he'd been reading for like 10 or 15 years. But when you're functionally illiterate and you don't have the time energy and you're operating in the circuit of capital and you don't have odium and you don't have relative time energy, which are different things, then you're not going to be able to read. And so what I put here on the whiteboard is the logic of capital. And so maybe this is open to some kind of modification. Maybe this is, subject to change. Maybe it has already changed. Maybe there's all kinds of nuance that we can add to it. Ultimately, we need to be able to do a sort of symbolic logic for capital in the 21st century, and that's the goal of Capital Mondays that I'm doing with Nance here. But it's just like, the plan wasn't to talk so much about Marx. The plan was not to talk so much explicitly about capital. It's just very, serendipitous, synergistic. The fact that this did take, it transpired this way. I love that. And so I wanted to come over here and kind of put the main names of the thinkers that we've been drawing upon in this conversation, because it's not just Illich, which was going to be more like the plan. No, it's Marx, it's Heidegger, it's Illich, it's Levinas. And the way the Heidegger factors in was when you said it's about the horizon, it's about the hermeneutic situation, and that's exactly right. So like the logic of capital is not just something that happens at this big structural level. It's like it actually happens in our hermeneutic devolvement or debasement, or you could say the structural stultification of time energy leads to these three equiprimordial things for Heidegger and being in time: understanding, discourse, state of mind, turning into nothing more than idle chatter and ambiguity and superficial curiosity that never commits to actually following anything through to its end. And of course, when you're talking about people getting caught up in these modes because just really being part of that circuit, I think that what it results in is we're constant positivity. We can have everything all the time, right? But we can't. And that's what time energy is supposed to make you realize, is that there are specific kinds of activities. I've got a bunch. I'll be doing a surprise lecture here after this where I'll go into my New Year's vision board and the problem with it concerning time energy as a sort of way of promoting the course that's coming up as well as the book. But just think about it, like multilingualism, music, intellectual comprehensive capabilities and limits, mental health and emotional showing up or communicating, physical fitness and health, being present, and networking or intellectual milieus are all different things. And most people outside of work only have the resources they think to take on one of them at a time. And the actual commodity form has installed itself in such a way so that this is true. So that if you want to be a runner and do marathons, or if you want to do jujitsu, or if you want to be weight training, and well, guess what? You choose one, motherfucker. You're not going to be able to afford all of those things. You choose one and you go to it 3 times a week, and that's your life. And it's like, well, I want to do all 3. What am I supposed to do? The problem is that the communities that form around these activities form around the idea of the hobby that becomes the passion, where it's like you're just doing that one thing outside of work. And it's like, yeah, but I also want to do yoga, and I also want to be slacklining and rock climbing and playing the piano and dancing and doing the harmonica, and like, come on, I want to be able to practice French and German and Spanish. And so when people see that we're doing all of these things at Theory Underground, it's like, well, where's the theory? Well, outside of the courses, obviously there's the theory. Outside of the books, obviously there's the theory. This is also the theory in practice. The practice is to show ourselves that there is a way, or if there isn't a way, to find out where are the limits and what is possible given our current situation. And obviously, if we can hack it so that we have relative time energy, so that we are freed up from working all the time. Right now, I'm only working part-time at Amazon. It's amazing to only work part-time. Last year, I was working full-time. Now, thanks to my subscribers, I'm working part-time. I hope in the next month to be able to quit my job. If I could just get a few more subscribers, let me grift. The point of that is to free myself up so that I can actually make the actualization of this kind of a lifestyle possible for myself, but also in being regularly doing runs and weight training and jiu-jitsu. I'm doing it with other people. Doing French, German, Spanish, I'm doing it with other people. Doing yoga and slacklining and rock climbing, I'm doing it with other people. Piano, dance, harmonica, I'm doing it with other people. Not everybody has the time or energy to do all of these things, and of course they don't, but I'm going to fucking do all of these things, god damn it. I want to be a whole human being. I want to be a person. It's not a right. There's no such thing as rights. I don't know that there are such things as natural rights. It's always been a privilege. It's kept away from us and hoarded by the few. And I want to do it. And that's me drowning, saying I will be defiant and I will do it. And people are like, oh, well, it's just this bourgeois fucking circle jerk of people just try. No, we're trying to show people what is possible. And if we can do it ourselves, to the degree that we can do it, we might be able to inspire other people to realize that there's something more than this insane logic, that this is not what should be running the world, right? All right, but with that, I want to throw it back to Nance, and I'm going to run out of the room. I'll be right there, though. I'm listening. But Nance, can you talk about reading? And then we'll turn it back over to Daniel, and he'll talk a little bit more about reading, and then we'll probably close out in a minute. But
yeah,
we've got like 15 minutes.
On your little spiel, your little rant you just went on, I think it's important to, I don't know, for me to drive home the point, like that's the point. Like the doing this, the process itself is fighting back against the instrumentalization and the mechanization and the logic of capital. Like that is it. So like for me, kind of talking to other people who don't already get it, it is difficult to articulate like, well, what are you doing? Because it's like on any given day, we might be doing French, German, Spanish, and a film club, and then reading, I don't know, Richard Bolin for 8 hours. Like we might do all those things in a given day. And it's hard to explain to people who aren't already hip to what we got going on. But that's it. Like the process itself is the point. And when it comes to reading, before really having the opportunity to sit down with these books, any given book, and go through it, and maybe not do line by line every time, but do deep readings and do readings with the intention of coming back to it, and maybe not necessarily clinging to the linearity of the text itself, but looking at the text as an object, and looking at the text as an object within a larger system of objects, and like really truly engaging with books. Like, yeah, I'd like to say I'd never read a book until reading a book with Dave. And I've read lots and lots of books. Sure, I'm a smart guy. I read all the books. Look at how smart I am. But no, like I haven't truly read a book before going through it and really tarrying with it and saying, I don't understand this. Let me sit here. Like, I'm not going to worry about progressing because I have to complete this book. Like, no, I want to understand this part so I can move on to the next part, so I can move on to the next part. And now, since I understand these parts, let me go back and reread and see how that changes and requilts everything. Yeah, I used to just chew through books to add to the like list of achievements. And now, no, it is about, I'm going to tarry with this book until I have a good understanding of what it's saying before I move on to the next.
Magnificent. A few things come to mind. I don't believe we read or know how to read until something lights up within us, until some flame catches. The word passion is also very interesting. We don't use that word very well in society. A passion is something you're willing to suffer for. And often if you want to ask people, like when people are like, oh, I don't know what to choose or what to focus on, there's so many possibilities, like the centipede, how does it use all its legs? What should I choose? And we don't know. A general heuristic that can be useful is what is something you're willing to suffer for or suffer to do? That tends to suggest there's something more going on. And actually, if the logic of capital, like I know you all have spoken on, is the system doesn't care if you rebel against it as long as your prime modus is to enjoy, right? So freedom is found in the willingness not to enjoy. So the thing that you are willing to do that causes you suffering is your training ground, if you will, to move outside the logic of capital. And you don't read until you read in a manner that makes you willing to suffer for that very reading, because that is an introduction of the alternative logic. Now, a way I've languaged it, we don't have to, this is the way I use it, is the difference between like discourse and rhetoric. And discourse is just the logic of capital, and it's just how I word it, and it's based on some of, obviously your Adorno's and your Foucault, like this notion of the structuring of the discourse. But I think it's very dangerous to suggest that there's only the discourse. There is the possibility of our structuring ourselves by a different mode or a different way of thinking, which some people have put as rhetoric. Now, that's a word that's loaded in the history of philosophy, but if you grant it to me here. The difference is between also lower order and high order causality. And low order causality, which I would align with the logic of capital or discourse, is when you see a billiard ball roll across the table, it hits another billiard ball and it moves. Basic law, cause and effect. High order causality is when a billiard ball rolls across the table, it hits another one, and you remember that time you used to play pool with your sister, and so you think to call her. There is a cause and effect there, but it is not reducible to what is observable, material, and immediate. The key to escaping the logic of capital is to engage in the practices that have you operate according to high-order causalities, not merely low-order causalities. Because if all you're doing is low order, then you're going to be captured by the logic of capital, and the system can predict you. So, for the attention economy to not just be in service of the logic of capital, it has to be a training ground for people to live according to high-order causalities, logics outside of capital, which means it's changing how you think. So you ask yourself the following question. Am I reading books so that I can win trivia games or add to the certification? Or am I reading in such a manner that changes how I think? And the key characteristic you want your thinking to change is that you begin to value difficulty. If you can find a thing that makes you value difficulty, not because you can tell other people I've done difficult things, but because it, not for certification or pride in a negative sense, but because you realize that your brain is stuck in irony, your brain is stuck in a logic of capital, and it is only through said difficulty, willingness to suffer for something, that your mind begins to open up to a different way of experience. That's what you want to watch. Those YouTube channels, those are the books you want to read. Those are the things you want to do, because that's moving you out of the imperative to enjoy. And then what I would say, I always love this from Schopenhauer's, and it makes me think of Austin Farrer as well. But Schopenhauer describes how much of education today is there's this ladder, and a man comes along with a bag, and he takes the rungs off the ladder and he stuffs it to go show people the rungs of the ladder. He's like, that's what we do education today, to collect rungs on a ladder and show them off. Really what education is supposed to be is you see the ladder and climb it. You climb the ladder. So what content is making you climb a ladder as opposed to collect rungs? What books and how reading books is making you climb a ladder versus collect rungs? And the key to climbing the ladder is that means something has lit inside of you that compels you to climb, as opposed to collect. Climbing a ladder can be difficult. It requires a certain suffering. Oh, and by the way, you can't see the top, so there's no guarantees. You don't know if it will give you your enjoyment. But something has lit. So the question is the following, and I pass it on. How does one read to have something lit within you that then makes you willing to do something even if it requires suffering for you for its own sake, because of the way that it changes how you experience the world? A few tips. 1, when you read a book, assume they're smarter than you. 2, assume that they use words differently than you think. 3, assume that you don't know what you don't know. 4, assume they don't fit into any simple ideology like left or right. 5, assume that they didn't write this book because they thought a bunch of people were going to be PhDs on it, and they're like, oh boy, I'm going to write this book so there's a bunch of scholars on me who can tell everyone they're Marx scholars. No, they wrote this book because they saw a problem with the world, and they wanted to help other people understand it. And by the way, if they were right, you've probably been captured in your thinking to be incapable to see the problem. So go into books assuming that they are going to help you see something that you do not have the eyes to see. And once you get that, you are going to work a lot harder. So there's more to be said, but those things come to mind.
Amazing. Fucking hats off. I say that, but I'm gonna leave my hat on, and the clapping's not real, so it's all fake. Don't worry, everybody. But fucking amazing. No, for real. I think we've got a couple minutes here to close out before we've got Ashley Frowley joining us from Athens, Greece. Oh my God. But I just wanted to say, like, I think when it comes to Marx and Heidegger and the way that they've been inherited, in the way that one has been whitewashed of his political involvements, or those political involvements were overstated in a sense that also flattens and reduces his genuine intervention and contributions. It's exactly what you're talking about here. But with Marx, it's the opposite. Instead of removing the political, whitewashing him like his family estate has done, it's the inheritors of his estate being a part of the Second International, Kautsky and Bernstein, that has such a huge part in turning his most theoretical moments, his most unsure moments, into overstated, definitive, confident moments for the sake of political mobilization of obviously something that he was a part of, but that he was not simply a part of, and that he was always super critical of, and that criticalness gets leveled out, and to the point where I don't even think Marx would be a Marxist. And I know that he said to his son-in-law or nephew that he wasn't, but beyond that, I just think that he wouldn't be. I think that he would do what we're doing, which is to say, create a new clearing, or you don't create the clearing. It's being disclosed by the situation. You have to become receptive to it, and you have to remove from yourself those things in the way. And the list of tips that Daniel just rattled off, I mean, that was amazing. Some of those are things that I address in my 3 Principles of Study as a Way of Life article, but a bunch of those are not. And so, first of all, if you, I would love to put something you write on that in a volume on method. There's a definite book in the works on method that will be one of the features coming out of the October conference in Boise. So I hope that you'll be able to make it to Boise, Daniel. I hope that you'll be able to make it to Portugal between the 23rd and 25th of May. There's 2 conferences. One is the one that's in Portugal. Of course, the whole tour is a distributed conference, but there's going to be like this sort of culminating event in Evora. Is that how you say it? Patricia's not here. I think it's Evora, which is like an hour from Lisbon. If you get flights now, it's only like $750 to $1,000, which is round trip from the States. If you leave from the right city, that's not too bad. Honestly, if you buy tickets last minute to come to the Boise October conference, it'll be about that much. So it's all about when you get those tickets. And so really, people who are good at spontaneity tend to be the ones who are in these streams, because I tend to organize kind of everything last minute, but I'm trying to get better about that. And so there's actually going to be a sequel event with Alenka Zupancic and others in 2 weeks from today on Thursday. It's going to be a continuation of the exact same thing. We're going to be talking about all of these same things, related stuff that we want to talk about on tour. I'll be rolling out the list of different anthologies that Theory Underground is going to be putting out, but basically we've got one on the concept of the PMC, which I'll be talking about with Benjamin Studebaker at the end of today's live stream. But we've also got one on critical media theory, and we've got another one on post-Marxism versus Marxism. We've got another one on it's called Human Futures. And I think it's going to actually have a question mark. And I'll want people who do stuff with Illich and people who do stuff who care about humanity, but also people who are post and transhumanist, to be able to enter into some kind of a dialogue there. And there will also be an entire anthology dedicated to the idea of the new Dark Age, or the 21st century Dark Age, and the Council of Nicaea event. So the Dark Age panel is going to be happening in Portugal, and the Council of Nicaea / Renaissance conversation is going to be in Boise in October. And so the two things go together, and this is just the way it's developing. It's amazing, and it's so much cooler than I thought it was going to be even 2 weeks ago. So, but with that, the questions of interpretation with Marx and Heidegger, people in Being in Time Division 2 are going to be learning all about the ways that he has been flattened and reduced by the one side that's liberal and depoliticizes, and the other side that's liberal and just calls him a fascist. And in reality, like, they're both partially right, but there's something way more interesting going on there, and we'll be getting into all of that. And I mean, if Thomas Sheehan is right, then the entire history of Marx of Heidegger's scholarship has actually been misunderstanding him as the thinker of being, when really he's the thinker of intelligibility itself. What is a source of intelligibility itself? And then, of course, with Marx, the whole history has been confusing his value for Marxism for Petit Ricardo and labor theory of value that reifies the circular logic of capital, which makes it so that even if you do some kind of a vanguardist state intervention, this just gets set in stone all the better, and its actual contradictions get hidden from view, but they're there nonetheless. And so the question is I mean, we know that time energy is the basis for what it ultimately gets flattened into labor power and then exchanged for money, commodities, more money, right? But on the other side, you've got like commodities, money, commodities, more, capital. And this is a circuit, right? Time energy is behind it on both sides, but also time energy is so much more outside of that, because then we get down into purpose and passion. So you're so good on bringing this in. I get into that in the afterword to my first book, Waypoint, where I talk about how does a mere passing curiosity develop into a research interest that can eventually become a passion. And I talk about it like a fire that gets going. Like at first it's just a spark of curiosity, and then you add fuel to it over time, and then it might, if you're lucky, and also cursed, consume you. And so that's the passion element. And we might not get the enjoyment in the sense that you were using the term, but if it turns into a passion, then you're definitely getting the other kind of enjoyment, the jouissance, the drive, right? And so, but I say that ultimately purpose is a really big part of that. We're creatures of purpose, that we've always been virtual purposive creatures. And outside of that, we're flat, cartoonish mockeries of ourselves. And so that's my little thing I wanted to say in close here. And now I want to give you guys each a chance, 1 minute, and you're out. And then we'll move on to Ashley. So handing it over to Nance, then Daniel.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time. I love the idea of passion being something you're willing to suffer for. I've been thinking about a lot about how we're resisting this instrumentalization and how it takes a lot of time, energy, dedication, and how that in itself might be seen as suffering from a certain perspective. But without that, like, no, I don't want to sit around and just eat Cheetos and be a lazy piece of shit, because that's what I would be doing were it not for pursuing the life of the mind. That type of suffering that's unacceptable. Like I would rather, maybe it's the Sisyphus thing. I don't fucking know, but I like it a lot.
Divine, and I've enjoyed this immensely, and thank you for the opportunity. I definitely think the critical notion is that the only way to have a different kind of mode in the being that you could say is more fulfilling, that is deeper, there's almost a difference between pleasure and deep, only comes through suffering. And that's really what humans thrive on, but that requires thinking outside the logic of immediacy. To close, I would also note when I read like Marx, I actually try to, every time I look at Marx, say Karl instead, and use the first names of thinkers, because that helps you escape the structure or trying to sit. So I read Adam Smith as Adam, because you're triggering, because really the last thing I'll say is the ability to say what you just did, Dave, on speaking, like I would call that rhetoric, a philosophical explanation where you're tying things together, you're seeing it together. That's very different from the conversation of discourse, which tends to make up a lot of chit chat, which is what'd you do today? What are you planning? What's your 5-year plan? It's what? Trivia. The ability to speak in this philosophical way, which I call rhetoric again, is actually a training to move outside the logic of capital. It is a way of talking that then being able to do changes how your mind thinks. And being able to do those sorts of things also helps you train to have the courage to operate outside the logic of capital. And really, as just a general heuristic, one of the things we can say is if you're wondering what your purpose would be, a general good thing is to become courageous. And if you focus on the things you need to do to be more courageous, that will have the secondary effect of helping you operate outside the logic of capital. More can be said, but gentlemen, I've appreciated it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. All right, we'll be right back after this. Take care, everybody.
Being is super uncool, and that's why you should do it. It's just like almost anything that's like cool anymore. yeah, it just sucks. And I think that's like what the underground movement has always been about, is just like seeing what's in the mainstream, being like, it ain't there, and kind of like cobbling something together, you know? And yeah, it's a little mismatched, but that's like its beauty.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, where workers with earbuds can find genuine liberation from necessity.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation: theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
We bring primary texts from leading lights of diverse fields to bear on topical issues and works popular in our current world. Theory Underground is a publishing house as well as lecture course and social media platform.
You've been reading Underground Theory.
Yes.
And
amazing book. I'm a publisher and an editor. I run a review of books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Jesus Christ.
Seriously.
This is a little experiment in what I, David McKerracher, can pull off without relying on the academy or the algorithmic dictates of the attention economy.
Usually a good edited collection has good essays, but you only want to read a few. Every essay makes me want to read the other essays because you have a vision. Everyone that you invited for a reason. You weren't some fake publicist who's like, "How's so-and-so's a new book, have them on your show." No, you only talk to people because you've read shit by them, that you've thought about, that you think has value, even if you disagree. So I think that's what's amazing.
I believe that I am, like so many others, pioneering a future in which educators can form learning webs that will make learning as a way of life enjoyable and emancipatory. However, before these tools become accessible, they have to be experimented with. That's why I built my own website and app using nothing more than my own saved wages, 5 patrons, and some small classes of students over the last year. Of course, I also have had my wife Anne's moral support and help with accounting so that I don't get in trouble with the IRS or whatever. In less than a year, Theory Underground has already put out 8 courses, 2 books, one, my book, Time Energy, and the other, Underground Theory, which has over 30 contributors, including works written by students at Theory Underground, some of my fellow travelers, and colleagues in the broader universe of Underground Theory. Beyond the books and courses, though, you will also find interviews, reading exegetical reaction sessions, and live weekly events for working class autodidacts, independent researchers, and renegade academics. These include a variety of clubs and cohorts that meet on a weekly or monthly basis. If you want to get involved, there are 4 main subscription levels.
Think of it like a gym membership, but for your mind.
The point is to make learning, practice, and theoretical comprehension a way of life. Support at this stage of the operation is more crucial than ever because my savings were used up over the last year of getting this established. If I can triple my subscribers in the next 2 months, I can quit my gig at Amazon and focus on this work full time. All I need is a few more people at each of the levels or a couple big time patrons who just want to see it happen. Right now I am doing a patron and site subscriber drive, so excuse the commercial. But if you end up really liking what goes on at this channel, consider signing up soon. If you cannot afford it, but want to get involved with some of the stuff behind the paywall, I have made a financial aid scholarship you can sign up for here in the description. Quick side note, some people ask about the profit motive. At this point, I have not actually made a return on any of my investment in terms of the amount of time energy that I put into things, the amount of savings I've actually put into things, the opportunity cost of the work that I'm doing as opposed to the other kinds of things that I could be doing for money. But more importantly, I don't actually make enough to pay for my cost of living. The goal is to make enough for my cost of living, and then once that is achieved, everything over that amount is going to go towards expanding the operation to the point where I can hire Michael Downs, aka Mikey of The Dangerous Maybe, to be a full-time researcher and part-time teacher at Theory Underground. Alright, so with that aside, I just want to say also, if you are a worker with earbuds, what's up? I see you. I work at Amazon part-time and everything I do is for my past self who used to work there full-time. Most workers with earbuds couldn't care less about theory, But I do believe a working class intellectual revolution could grow out of the underground theory scene. My hope is that what I have built here will contribute to making the scene something more than just a scene, and you into something more than just a scene kid. We're trying to make this into a real intellectual milieu capable of leading a way forward beyond the imminent crises facing humanity. But for that, we need thinking now more than ever.
Start thinking.
I hope that you either will or have enjoyed the program, and also make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and leave this playing in the background all the time while you're doing other things.
Playing long-form Theory Underground content in the background while you do things has, in the near future, been scientifically proven to emancipate minds from the functional illiteracy imposed on workers by the structural stultification of time energy. This is achieved by reterritorializing circumspective concern.
Also, to some degree, it is for the algorithm.
Think of it like a gym membership, but for your mind!
I love you so much.
I love you too.
Just want to make a quick shout out here at the end to my patrons over at Patreon. I set the Patreon up like a week and a half ago because the fact is not everybody wants to be a subscriber at my website. Not everybody wants to take courses at the website. And so people who are looking to support in some other way, Patreon is kind of a tried and true route, and some people really prefer it. And so to those who are becoming patrons at my Patreon, thank you so much. If I can get up to $500 per month between people over at my website and people over at the Patreon and people over at the Substack, collectively, I will be able to quit the job at Amazon and do this full time. And so to the people who just started trying to make that possible over at Patreon, special shout out to Alexander, Neil, Darian Large, and Nikolash. You guys are really helping make the difference. Really appreciate it. And to anybody who becomes a subscriber or a patron here in the next month, I just want to say you get a free copy of my new book, Time Energy, Why You Have No Time or Energy. And you really incentivized me to get the audio recording of this finished, which I've been working on. So thank you. Take care, everybody.